Hello, and welcome to The Real American Revolution, a public television series devoted to interviewing authors and historians about what really happened during our American Revolution. My name is Randy Flood, and this program is brought to you by two nonprofit entities, The Real American Revolution and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education. Now, today my guest is Jack Buchanan, and this is the third in a series of interviews with Jack. Jack is one of our nation's foremost historians on the American Revolution and is affectionately known as the Dean of the Southern Campaigns. His books on the Revolution include the prize-winning The Road to Valley Forge, How Washington Built the Army That Won the Revolution, and the widely acclaimed The Road to Guilford Courthouse, The American Revolution in the Carolinas. Now, Jack's most recent book, The Road to Charleston, Nathanael Greene and the American Revolution, is already a nationwide bestseller, and we're going to be talking about that today. So, Jack, welcome to the program. Glad to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Well, Jack, previously we discussed all those events which really led to the war in the South and the impact of partisan guerrilla warfare in that region. Now, after the fall of Charleston in May of 1780, Congress selected General Horatio Gates to rebuild and command the Continental forces in the South, but in mid-August, Gates suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Camden. Things looked pretty bleak for American independence. Enter Nathanael Greene. Who exactly was Nathanael Greene, and how and why was he chosen to command in the South?
Nathanael Greene was a Rhode Islander. He was a anchor smith, a small merchant, forge master. And when he reported to George Washington with the Rhode Island Army of Observation in 1775 outside Boston, his military experience amounted to readings in military history and about 8 or 9 months on the parade ground. That was it. He'd never been to war. He'd never commanded troops before. In fact, he'd been in the rear rank of his local militia unit because he limped from childhood. And they didn't want him out front where they'd see that limp. But Washington found that Greene had better command of his army than any other leader in the Continental Army around Boston. And he got to know Greene, he got to like him, and he had faith in Greene, and he never lost that faith. Then Greene went on. He was supposed to command at the Battle of Long Island. He got malaria and wasn't able to. He was probably very fortunate in that regard, because I think any American commander would have lost that battle. But he grew in Washington's estimation. He made one major error. He insisted that Fort Washington at the northern end of Manhattan could be held. It couldn't. It was a disaster. They lost 2,800 troops when the British took it, or rather the Hessians took it, and tons and tons of valuable arms and ammunition. He wrote to his friend Henry Knox. He said, I feel mad, vexed, sick, and sorry. But he went on. Washington didn't lose faith in him. And he went on during the retreat in New Jersey to reveal his grasp of logistics when he set up supply depots the length of New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And then as far as the rest of the Northern campaign, he proved himself in combat command and of course as quartermaster general during that awful winter at Valley Forge.
Mm-hmm. Now, Washington had put forth his name, correct? But the Congress decided to go actually with Horatio Gates first.
Yes. Yes.
But then after Gates's demise,
Congress threw up its hands and turned the choice over to Washington, and Washington immediately chose Greene.
Mm-hmm. Well, like George Washington, Greene was often a bitter critic of the militia. And yet he wrote to Francis Marion, and I quote, "We must endeavor to keep up a partisan war." Why did he write that, and why did he do it?
Well, as far as endeavor to keep up a partisan war, you have to take the phrase that came before that first. He wrote, until a more permanent army can be collected,
Mm-hmm.
we must endeavor to keep up a partisan war. Well, by that he meant a continental army large enough to fight the war by itself. He probably knew that wasn't going to happen, and it didn't happen. A permanent army that large was never collected. He was forced to fight a war using partisans as well as regulars. And he did it brilliantly.
Mm-hmm. Well, did Greene and the leading militia commanders really operate that well together? You know, the people like Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, and Thomas Sumter?
Yeah, in two cases, yes. Greene thought highly of Andrew Pickens, and they operated splendidly together. And when Greene sent Lee to command with Pickens in the second siege of Augusta, he advised Lee that Pickens is a worthy, good man. Be solicitous of him. And especially when it came up to divvying up supplies after the fall of the fort, that Lee didn't grab everything for the Continental Army, that they divided things equally. So he and Pickens, yes. He had one minor falling, well, it could have been a major falling out. He had a falling out with Marion. Otherwise, they worked well together, and Lee, who of course reported to Greene, worked well with Marion. He kept nagging Marion for horses. Horses were so valuable in the Southern War, especially. Even Cornwallis knew this. He said, the war in the South cannot be fought without horses. So he kept nagging Marion for horses. And Sumter threw fuel on the fire by saying, telling Greene that, oh, Marion can get all the horses you want. And he kept at him and kept at him. And then in one letter, which should have remained unwritten, he accused the Marion's men of using captured British horses for their own use. And Marion got highly upset and threatened to resign and go to Philadelphia. And that's when they first met. Lee and Marion had just taken one of the British river ports, Fort Mott, Fort Mott on the Santee River. And Greene, mounted and with a guard, rode to Fort Mott, and he and Marion sat down and had a talk, cleared the air. If only one of them had kept a diary or a journal, or somebody had been there to take notes. We don't know what they said,
Mm-hmm.
but the air was cleared, and they got along fine after that.
Okay. How did Greene get along with Sumter?
You know, Winston Churchill said after World War II that the cross that he had to bear was the cross of Lorraine, by which he meant Charles de Gaulle, the very uptight French leader. Greene's cross was Thomas Sumter. Sumter was a prima donna, had a chip on his shoulder, almost always refused to cooperate with Continental officers. Greene's leading biographer, Sumter's leading biographer wrote of him, in war, he was a politician. In peace, he was an old soldier. William Richardson Davie, a fine officer who was Greene's confidant, they were quite close, said that Greene would have had Sumter arrested if it had been politically possible to do so. But it wasn't, so he just had to let it go.
Interesting. Well, following the impressive battle at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th, 1781, Greene lost the battle to a much smaller British command of about 900 troops at Hobkirk's Hill on April 25th, 1781. Now, who was responsible for that fiasco, and why couldn't the British capitalize on their victory?
Greene was responsible for the loss. He didn't think so. He blamed it on Colonel John Gunby, who commanded 1st Maryland. As Greene went on the offensive at Hobkirk's Hill. And as the troops were advancing, a captain of 1st Maryland was shot and killed. And it upset, he was a very popular man. It upset his troops, and they stopped and didn't go on at first. Gunby, to reorder the troops, retreated about 50 yards. Greene claimed he didn't use the word loss of momentum, but that's what he meant, that momentum was lost, and then the British swept forward, won the battle, and Greene blamed it all on Gunby. In fact, he wrote, Gunby was the sole cause of the loss. And he wrote about 7 letters on this to various people, 2 to Horatio Gates of all people, and kept blaming Gunby for the loss. I think Greene was to blame, first, for going on the offensive. Light Horse Harry Lee, who was not there, wrote that he should have stayed on the defensive. Now, I'm often critical of Lee, but I think he was right. William Richardson Davie agreed. He should have remained on the defensive. Mm-hmm. But one thing I think we always have to keep in mind is that there were 2 armies on the field that day. And the British commander, Lord Rawdon, was a fine combat commander and went on to a spectacular career after the Revolutionary War in India, where he was commander-in-chief and defeated one of the world's great fighting peoples, the Gurkhas. Mm-hmm. So there were 2 armies out there that day. No, Greene was to blame for that loss. But Rawdon could not follow up the victory because the whole country, as he admitted to Cornwallis, was in revolt behind him. Marion and Lee had taken Fort Watson, Fort Mont, and now there was only one British fort on the Santee protecting their lines of communication and supply to the backcountry. That was Fort Granby, and that would eventually fall. So he couldn't follow up his victory for that reason, and also because Greene, beaten but unbowed, retreated behind, across the Wateree River, and went into the high country. Now, it's very rugged. I've driven that country back there, behind the Wateree River, and entrenched himself on a height. And Rawdon thought, if I attack him in that position where he is, I'm going to lose too many troops. Mm-hmm. And so he rounded up all the Tories who wanted to leave, abandoned Camden, and marched for Charleston.
Mm-hmm. Well, Augusta, Georgia at 96, the latter, which was a British fortification in western South Carolina, were known really as Loyalist training camps. And the Americans laid siege to both forts, with Andrew Pickens and Light Horse Harry Lee capturing Augusta. But why was Greene unable to capture 96 in a siege that really began in May and it went through June of 1781?
Well, first, the British commander, or the Loyalist commander at 96, was a very tough guy, John Harris, Lieutenant Colonel John Harris Kruger of New York. Good commander, a really, really wonderful commander. So he had that facing him. Plus, 96 was a strong post, a strongly built post. But the real reason, they neglected to cut off the water supply. South of the town itself was the Spring Branch in a ravine. And there was a communications trench running not from the town, but from the jail that was on the way to the Spring Branch. There was a communications trench running from the jail down into the ravine to the Spring Branch. That was their water supply. He failed to cut off the water supply. That water supply was 167 yards from the town. To get water at night, that's the length and about another 2/3 of a football field. To get water at night, they sent naked slaves, black slaves, crawling down that communications trench, which is about 3 or 4 feet high, down to the spring branch with buckets to bring water back. That's why he failed to take 96 for not cutting off the water supply.
Interesting. Well, why did Greene lose the Battle of Eutaw Springs? Now, that was on September 8th, 1781, and that was a very costly battle on both sides, with, I think, over 500 troops on either side being killed, wounded, or captured. Why did he lose Eutaw Springs?
He lost Eutaw Springs. I find Eutaw Springs quite interesting battle. The British commander, he was Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart. We don't know an awful lot about him. He wrote terribly fawning letters to Cornwallis, but we didn't know much about him as a battlefield commander until Eutaw Springs. And there, behind the battlefield, behind the British camp, was a brick house, a 2-story brick house. And he told the commander of the New York Volunteers, he said, at the first sign of trouble, take your men into that house, barricade yourselves in there. And it looked like Greene was going to win that battle. The militia, contrary to what Thomas Sumter thought, stood up, fought a set-piece battle against the British until it came to bayonet time. They didn't have bayonets, and if they had, they didn't even know how to use them. When the British attacked with bayonets, they skedaddled. But then the regulars came on. 1st Maryland, the North Carolina Continentals, they came on. The British regulars retreated, and at that first sign of trouble, the New York Volunteers, and I think they were commanded by a colonel by the name of Sheridan, got into the house and just wreaked havoc from the upper floors, firing at Americans coming across the field. That's when Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard was badly wounded. That house saved the British bacon. It really did. And then William Washington made a huge mistake when he charged British troops that were inside a thicket. And he himself was, Washington himself was unhorsed, bayoneted, and taken prisoner, matter of fact. He lost that battle because of British being able to take refuge in that house and wreak havoc upon the Americans coming across the field. There was another reason he lost too, and I think this is true of all of his battles. There's a story about Napoleon being harangued by people at court in favor of a favorite general of theirs. And they kept telling Napoleon how brave he was, how tactically smart he was, and everything that he had done. And finally, Napoleon, they wanted their general to get a field marshal's baton. And finally, Napoleon, tired of it, he said, yes, 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 I know all that. But is he lucky? Eisenhower is supposed to have said the same thing about a general they were considering for an important command in World War II. Is he lucky? Greene was unlucky in battle. Unlucky in battle.
Interesting. Wow. Well, Greene operated under some very severe manpower problems throughout his command in the South. Why didn't he try to recruit black troops?
Oh, he did try to recruit black troops. He wrote a strong letter to Governor John Rutledge and recommending the raising of about 2,000 to 3,000 black troops commanded by white officers. And Rutledge wrote back and said, the council can't decide this. It will have to wait for the reconvening of the legislature. And by the way, just as an offside, one of Greene's great attributes was his political maneuvering and he was dead set on reviving the civil government of both Georgia and South Carolina, and having legislatures sitting and everything. Anyway, he wrote this letter. Rutledge wrote back and said would have to wait until the legislature convened. And they convened. The motion was made to raise black troops. Blacks had not been armed in South Carolina since the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1718. And they were only armed during that war because South Carolina almost went under. Yamasee warriors were right up against the walls of Charleston during that war. But after the war, they were disarmed and never rearmed. Well, the South Carolina legislature was horrified. According to the figures we have, fortunately letters that have been left by people who were there, 10 to 15 were in favor, about 100 against. They were just absolutely horrified, said absolutely not, no black troops. And one of the reasons was that they thought the whole thrust of this attempt to arm black troops was emancipation, that Greene wanted to emancipate the slaves, which he did not. There were plenty in the North who did want to do that, but he did not. So he tried, he failed to raise black troops.
Interesting. Well, Jack, here's a question that I think a lot of historians want or need to know. What was the real relationship between Greene and his wife, Katherine, otherwise known as Katie?
It was a love match. He was much older than her when they married, but it was a love match. And she followed him and by the way, as she was described as a small brunette of high color with a flashing pair of dark eyes. And she was vivacious, probably flirtatious. She loved to dance. And I don't know if Greene could dance because of that bad leg that he had. Loved to dance. Washington was very fond of her. She followed Greene in the North from post to post, endured everything, lived in a hut with him for a while at Valley Forge. And every time they got reunited, she got pregnant again. They had 4 or 5 children. And she wanted to go south with him, and he wouldn't let her. And he wrote to her, he says, "You have no idea of the horrors of the Southern War." He said, "Murders here are as frequent as petty disputes to the northward." And she kept begging him to go. She came under assault by vicious 18th century gossips that she was unfaithful to Greene while he was in the South. Greene had asked, oh dear, I've lost his name. His name's on the tip of my tongue. I may remember it. He had asked one of his friends to take her supplies in Rhode Island, and he did. And this fellow was rich and handsome and married, and he visited Katty in Rhode Island. And then the gossips took over that she had committed adultery. Well, he finally allowed her to come south, and it was a joyous reunion. And then after the war, they were living in Georgia on a plantation, Mulberry Plantation, that Georgia gave him after the war. That was done in those days. So anyway, they end up on Mulberry Plantation. Greene dies in 1786, right after, 3 years after the war. Katty's a widow. The gossips took over again. Well, and she did have a couple of affairs. After Greene died, she had this man who had visited her in Rhode Island. She had an affair with him in New York City. Probably had an affair with Nathaniel Pendleton, who had been one of Greene's military aides during the war. Well, she was 31 when Greene died. Well, what was she supposed to do? Enter a convent?
Sure, sure.
She never remarried,
Mm-hmm.
never remarried, raised her children, died at about 60.
Mm-hmm. There was rumors that Anthony Wayne was one of the people that she was
Yeah,
involved
yes,
with.
there were rumors he was in love with her. He
Mm-hmm.
was deeply in love with her.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could remember the name. I just can't right now, of the man in the North. Wadsworth, James Wadsworth.
Okay.
James Wadsworth. Rich, handsome, married, and in love with Kathy. And she had an affair with him in New York City. As I told a group, I gave a talk at Fraunces Tavern Museum down in the financial district of New York City, which was the city in the 18th century. And I told them about Kathy, and I said, and she had an affair with James Wadsworth here in New York City, perhaps right next door, because this was the city then, you know. Yeah, James Wadsworth. Greene, Anthony Wayne was deeply in love with her, but they did not have an affair. But a lot of people believe that today and keep saying.
Sure. Well, Jack, one final question. We've asked this, of course, in previous sessions. What's the one takeaway from the road to Charleston that every American needs to know?
I would say the impact of individuals on great events. Greene and his whole cast of supporting characters, Lee, Sumter, Marion, Pickens, other names people aren't familiar with, Brandon, Bratton, Isaac Shelby, Elijah Clark, all these partisan commanders, the impact, and the teenagers, Robert Henry, James Potter Collins, Thomas Young, 16-year-olds going to war. Yes, the impact of individuals on great events.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I think that's what I take away, not only from this book, but much history, much history.
Excellent. Well, Jack, that looks like all the time we have today. So thank you so much for taking time to join us for a wonderful discussion of The Road to Charleston. Now, folks, this is the book, and I'll hold it up here so everyone can see. The Road to Charleston. Nathanael Greene and the American Revolution. Now it's available from Amazon and other outlets as well. It's a great sequel to The Road to Guilford Courthouse. If you want to know about the war in the South and the Southern campaigns, these two books combined are the books to have. There's no question about it. Now, today our guest has been author and historian Jack Buchanan. So join us again at the Real American Revolution and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education when we interview other outstanding historians about what really happened in the American Revolution. So on behalf of Jack Buchanan and myself, goodbye for now.
Thanks for inviting me, Randy.
Great to have you, Jack. Thank you so much.